Good morning. As you take your seat, our ushers will be helping you as they receive our offerings, and thank you for your continued giving and generosity towards what we do here at Westside. I'm excited to introduce you to our Whitespace this morning. You'll notice in your journal that we have several pages throughout the year that are devoted to Whitespace, which, as it explains in the journal, is just a little step out of a series for 1 week to talk about something which we feel is relevant to us at this particular moment. This week, I'm excited to say that our Whitespace is focused on worship. And after 3 weeks of you listening to me talking about grace, I decided to bring some backup this week in the form of two faces that you may well recognize. Why don't you say hi to Bob and Heather? In my opinion, and the opinion of all of us in leadership here at Westside, worship is a really key component of what it is to be a Christian community. And we want to think about that, we want to reflect on that, and the three of us are just going to bring some different reflections on worship this morning, which will tie together and lead us in a time of communion together. So we hope that you're looking forward to that already. I'm going to begin for you in Exodus chapter 16. We find ourselves in this story where God has just rescued the Israelites from Egypt. Several hundred years of slavery this country has been in. This people have been found themselves in huge burden of death and slavery. And God rescues them miraculously. And as if he didn't do enough miracles just getting them out of slavery, he then leads them across the Red Sea, parts these waters, and they come across the other side into this desert where they begin their journey to a new and promised land. But because it's a desert, there's a sort of shortage of food. It kind of goes with the name, right? And so despite all this incredible miraculous stuff that God has just done for them, 5 minutes after arriving in the desert, the Israelites start complaining to God and Moses and anyone who will listen. It says this: the Israelites said to them, "If only we had died by the hand of the Lord in the land of Egypt." Because complaining is always rational, remember. "When we sat by the flesh pots and ate our fill of bread, you have brought us out into this wilderness to kill this whole assembly with hunger." And then the Lord said to Moses, "I am going to rain bread from heaven for you, and each day the people shall go out and gather enough for that day. And in that way I will test them, whether they will follow my instruction or not." In the morning, it says later on in this chapter, verse 13, "In the morning there was a layer of dew around the camp. When the layer of dew lifted, there on the surface of the wilderness was a fine flaky substance, as fine as frost on the ground. When the Israelites saw it, they said to one another, 'What is it?' The word's in Hebrew, manna. For they did not know what it was. Moses said to them, 'It is the bread that the Lord has given to you to eat. This is what the Lord has commanded. Gather as much of it as each of you needs. An omer to a person according to the number of persons, all providing for those in their own tents.'" Now, an omer is a size roughly equivalent to a Simpsons character, okay? The Israelites did so, some gathering more, some less. But when they measured it with an omer, those who gathered much had nothing over, and those who gathered little had no shortage. They gathered as much as each of them needed. And Moses said to them, "Let no one leave any of it over until morning." But they did not listen to Moses. Some left part of it until morning, and it bred worms and became foul. And Moses was angry with them. Morning by morning, they gathered it as much as each needed. And then 10 verses later, it says this: "The house of Israel called it manna." From the Hebrew, what is it? "It was like coriander seed, white, and the taste of it was like wafers made with honey." Manna for me works as a bit of a metaphor for our engagement with worship. Because when I read the story of the Israelites and their engagement with manna, it's kind of my story. My story generally runs from God doing incredible things in my life, me complaining. God doing more incredible things in my life, me complaining some more. God continuing to provide for me despite my incessant commitment to complaining about the great things that God seems to be doing. Perhaps that's your story. Perhaps it's our story. That it's easy to look and think, goodness, what ungrateful Israelites. But so easily, our primary connection with God is one of complaint. Or sometimes actually, maybe not complaint, just asking. If you think about your own life, how often is it that we're closer to God when we need something than when we don't need something? Is our prayer more intense when we actually need something from God? Is our worship more focused when we have an agenda? And notice as these people come together, how similar this beautiful picture of all of the Israelites gathered together, whether gathering much or gathering little, notice how similar it is to church. That no matter where you come from, no matter what your background is, what your history is, what your social status is, we come to church and find the same Jesus. This story of manna, for me, echoes the communion that we're about to take in a few minutes' time. No matter where you're from, you come and you take the same bread and you take the same cup and you remember that the one Jesus rescued all of us. But what I really think is amazing is that we get caught up so often in what it is that we want from God in worship, in life perhaps, that we can forget the beauty of mystery, the beauty of sometimes saying, what is this? Now, for many of us, we can relate that to worship. Perhaps you can remember the first time you came to church and you walked in and it maybe seemed a little like how you would expect church to be. There was people and there was chairs and then people started singing, and invariably somebody that's in church for the first time will turn to their friend and go, what is this? Like, what are we doing? And sometimes we lose that sense of mystery and of willingness to ask that question, what is it that we're doing here? In our modern world, we like understanding. We need to know the nuts and bolts of things before we'll get involved in it. We like the safety of feeling like if we can understand something, then that means it's okay. And worship calls us into a place of mystery. It calls us to step out, not into a mental process, but it calls us to step out into something that's an experience, something that requires you to taste and see before you can start to really get to grips with what's going on. Worship calls us to something unknown, which isn't that new for us, to be honest with you. How well do you really understand how food sustains you? How well do you really get how the things you put in your mouth keep you alive? Perhaps if you frequent this place, you don't understand it well at all. But did it ever stop you eating? Did you ever say, until I master the understanding of how my body processes food, I'm not going to eat anymore? No, actually, the mystery doesn't bother us because, and here's the point, we don't need to understand something for it to sustain us. You might look at manna and say, what is it? But you still eat it, and it keeps you alive. In worship, there's a mysterious call that says you may not yet understand this, but be part of it. Step into it. Embrace the mystery of calling our God and praising his name, because in that mystery, we find something of the depth of God. I want to encourage us as a people to be serious about worship. See, because worship's a funny thing in church. Like, some of us are slightly suspicious that worship is the thing we do so that everyone's here by the time we do the teaching. Because I mean, like, if we do the teaching right at the start, then loads of people will miss it, and the teaching is the most important bit, right? Well, what if worship was as important as teaching? What if what we gathered together to do on a Sunday in worship was as important as anything we say now? How would that change how we were as a people if we thought it that way? I want to encourage us to think that way about worship. I'd love to encourage you to make a decision that says, actually, let me get to church for the worship as importantly as the teaching. I think sometimes we can slip into bad habits that stop us doing that. Don't worry if we're late, it's only the worship. Or actually, I'm here, but let me just grab a latte just before I sit down because I want to have a latte because that's as important as worship. So I've asked the coffee bar team to stop serving lattes once the service starts. I said, let's actually take our worship seriously. If you want a latte, The coffee bar's open before the service. But actually, let's as a community commit to say, we're really serious about this. Worship's not when we just catch up with our friends. Worship's not when we get a coffee. Worship's where we stand in community with the Creator God of the universe and say, let's praise His name together. I think when we do that, we'll discover that like manna, this worship with its incredible mystery is beautiful, sweet, and connects us to our providing and creating God. Heather.
Well, I'm so glad I have to go after you. There's a beautiful story to be reminded of today. And this week I was going through my office cupboards and I found the Bible that I used to study with as a teenager. And I opened to this chapter that we're going to read today. And I found that the only words highlighted on that page in Mark 14 was this very story. And I was taken back, and I remembered this was a moving story for me as a young girl. So let's read it together. While Jesus was in Bethany, reclining at the table in the home of Simon the leper, a woman came with an alabaster jar of very expensive perfume made of pure nard. She broke the jar and poured the perfume on his head. And some of those present were saying indignantly to one another, "Why this waste of perfume? It could have been sold for more than a year's wages and the money given to the poor." And they rebuked her harshly. "Leave her alone," said Jesus. "Why are you bothering her? She has done a beautiful thing to me. The poor you will always have with you, and you can help them anytime you want. But you will not always have me. She did what she could. She poured perfume on my body beforehand to prepare for my burial. And truly I tell you, wherever the gospel is preached throughout the world, what she has done will also be told in memory of her." It's a beautiful story. So Jesus takes this incident and shows us the true value of it. He says, "She has done a beautiful thing to me." The beauty of it lies in its very extravagance, how much she gave. The woman did not spare any of the perfume. She broke the flask and poured the whole thing on him. And the others, with their practical minds, saw it was worth more than a year's wages and thought, this woman wasted an enormous amount of money when she got rid of it. Jesus thought it was a timely thing that she had done, I think. It was something that could be done now. And you may find there are opportunities that come in our life that happen in the moment, that they never happen again. This woman had sensed this and had seized the moment to do this. It was out of the sensitivity of her heart that she realized that the timing was right. And Jesus saw this. He recognized it. Then she did what was feasible. It says she did what she could. She couldn't fix him a meal. Maybe there was no time for that. She couldn't make a garment for him. There was nothing else she could do to show her love but this. And so she did it. This beautiful, lavish act. So when you read a story or you watch a movie, there's always different characters in the story. And I don't know if you find this, but I find I always want to be the hero of the story or the good guy or Batman. So in this story, seriously, there's Jesus, there's the woman, and there's the disciples and the others in the room, the crowd. So I ask myself, who am I in this story? And I think my whole life, I actually wanted to be the woman with the alabaster jar. But I think what life can do to us is we can become the people on the other side of the room easily. The disciples or the crowd who saw it as waste. There are often people who try to place a monetary value on things. And they seem to know the price of everything, but not always the value. And I think here's these disciples who were actually sitting and walking with Jesus for over 3 years. But maybe they'd taken him for granted. So they had forgotten the essence of his presence and forgot what it was all about. And maybe we do too. I know that I do. I remember when I was a little girl and I just loved sitting at the piano, being quiet before him, praying, singing, writing songs. I remember my parents used to tell me that I would fall asleep with my Bible a lot of nights, and I remember having so much time for God. Then I went to university, trying to figure out what I'm going to do with my life. Then I fell in love and got married right after graduation. Started working in the church immediately. More responsibility, more demands, more tasks. Then we had children over the next 6 years, and I found myself having less and less time and worshiping God in the cracks of the responsibility of life. So as you get older, there becomes pressure on your time that gives you reasons not to worship. And being a worship leader for 11 years, since I was 11, I'm still learning this lesson. And actually this week, I felt a bit envious of this woman with the alabaster jar. That without hesitation, she poured an entire year's salary on Jesus' head without even thinking about it. And there's too many times that I hesitate or let life's reasons keep me from it. Which brings me to say that there can be a temptation to think that worship can seem like a waste of time. Except when we look back in Mark, it says, "Leave her alone. Why are you bothering her? She has done a beautiful thing to me." Worship can seem like it's a waste of time when we think it's about us, our schedule, our timeline. But that's the point. It's not about us. It can feel like we're wasting our time until we shift our focus and realize that it's really about him. There's a woman named Marva Dawn who actually calls worship a royal waste of time. And she believes this title explains just what worship is. She chose the word royal to remind us that God is the center of attention and focus at all times. That worship is for God, so that we don't get self-centered and say, what do I get out of this? That's not what's important. The importance is what God gives us. And he gives us his grace. Waste of time, meaning we actually waste our time being with God. Its purpose is not so we can accomplish certain things or worship in a certain way or sing that song a certain way. But instead, we absolutely give up ourselves and put ourselves in God's hands. We waste our time so we can receive freely. Think about this. When we come to church, we waste an hour with the one who changes everything. It's an hour of our time that we are pouring out our worship on the most valued person, Jesus. We could all fill our schedules with important things, but this is what Jesus says is beautiful and right, and even says what she will be remembered for. Without hesitation, she gave extravagantly. I want to be remembered for being an extravagant worshiper. I want Westside to be a church that worships extravagantly. Before I hand it over to Bob, let me read you this beautiful quote from Marva Dawn. Worship ought not to be construed in a utilitarian way. Its purpose is not to gain numbers, nor for our church to be seen as successful. Rather, the entire reason for our worship is that God deserves it. Worship immerses us in the regal splendor of the King of the cosmos, provides opportunities for us to enjoy God's presence in corporate ways that takes us out of time and into the eternal purposes of God's kingdom. And as a result, we shall be changed. But not because of anything we do. God, on whom we are centered and to whom we submit, will transform us by his revelation of himself.
Thank you, David and Heather, for two amazing pieces. And so I'm going to anchor this talk, and you know how that works. They put the heaviest guy at the end of the rope. So we've talked about the mystery of worship, and we've talked about how we have to push against the values of efficiency and monetary value when it comes to this moment, as Heather has just said. And we end today by grounding ourselves in the central act of Christian worship, the Lord's table, the Eucharist, our communion meal. And our Lord told us to do this. And I remember, and I think it was C.S. Lewis who alerted me to this truth. Maybe you know this, but I had to learn it. When Lewis said, we don't begin by understanding, we begin by doing, and in the doing, we start to enter into the mystery. So maybe we could imagine our worship like bread. So we began, as David talked about, manna, bread, our daily food. Worship, in that sense, we could say, is something that sustains us. And of course, it is an experience. We experience bread. It was just a week or so ago, we did an Italian meal at our home. And so I went down to the Italian supermarket and got the fresh bread right when it came out. Actually, I was getting some meats and cheeses at the back in the deli, and she said, the bread is out. Go get it before anybody else gets it. And I ran out there and grabbed my bread. And I love that bread because there's nothing like good bread. The texture and the taste and the smell. You know, when I was growing up, my mother would make buns on Saturday morning, and I would wake to the smell of fresh bread in the house. Yes, I had a good upbringing. Yes. But like bread, worship is more than simply the experience of it. It is sustenance. It actually imparts life into us in a way that we don't understand. And that's what David was saying about the manna. And so we enter into this moment in what God is doing to give us life. Something deeper goes on than what we feel. Although the feelings are important, but it's deeper than that. So in one of Jesus's most famous sermons in John chapter 6, a fascinating piece that would take some time to unwrap, Jesus calls himself the bread of life. Jesus said to them, very truly I tell you, it is not Moses who has given you the bread from heaven, the manna, but it is my Father who gives you the true bread from heaven. For the bread of God is the bread that comes down from heaven and gives life to the world. Sir, they said, always give us this bread. Then Jesus declared, I am the bread of life. Whoever comes to me will never go hungry, and whoever believes in me will never be thirsty. An amazing statement. And when Jesus is calling himself the bread of life, he's saying that he is the food we need. That he is our sustenance, our nourishment, our life, and our turn to him in worship, to pay attention, to value, to, in some mysterious way, to eat of his life, to take him into ourselves, is what gives us sustenance. And I was so struck the other day as I was thinking about this text when Jesus says, whoever comes to me will never go hungry. Whoever, without prejudice, without qualification, except that you hunger and you want to be here. None rejected. There's no qualification to come to the table today except that you willingly want to be here and come and take and eat. So I have a story to tell before we come to the table. I was living in Vancouver in graduate studies years ago. And one afternoon I was sitting at my desk actually working on John chapter 6 and the bread of life. I was actually writing on Jesus is the bread of life. And a phone call came right in that moment. Hello, Bobby. And so when I am called Bobby, it means it's my family calling me because they're recalling when I was little, Bobby. And they said, "Hello, Bobby, it's your Aunt Betty. And it's been years since we've seen you, but we heard you were here in Vancouver." Now, Aunt Betty is my grandmother's sister. And there was Betty, and there was Martha, and those were the two sisters of my grandmother. And then there was John and Henry, the two brothers. And now Henry lived with Betty and Martha in an apartment in Richmond where we were living, attending graduate school at UBC. And I knew about them, but only distantly, because these are my grandmother's siblings, and I'd been away from BC for years. But now here was Betty on the phone. And after a few pleasantries, she said, "Would you be willing to bring communion over for your Uncle Henry? He wants to take communion, and we wondered if you would do that for him." And I told her, "Yes, of course." And she said, "Could you come this afternoon?" And I said, "Yes." And I called my mother right away and said, "Can you tell me about Betty and Martha and Henry? They've asked me to come over and bring communion to Henry." And she said, "That's amazing." And then she began to fill me in on the backstory, how Grandma and her siblings had grown up as Russian Mennonite missionary kids. My grandmother actually was born in India as a Mennonite missionary child. And there was that time when they were back in the Crimea in southern Russia. And my great-grandfather said now he was going to go back to India. He was going to return to the mission field. And Henry had pleaded with my great-grandfather to stay home. But my great-grandfather had said, "No, I'm going back." And Henry became embittered in that moment. He became very angry at God and angry at his father and angry at the church. And maybe you could say a kind of life disappointment had taken hold of him. And Mom told me how Betty and Martha and Henry had left the church when they were young adults. And they'd all immigrated to Canada. It's an amazing story how they came here. But Henry carried this silent anger all his life. And if we're meant to feed on Christ as our life, then Henry was feeding on something else. He was feeding on disappointment. He was feeding on a bitterness, an anger. I remember my mother used to say many times to us, what's eating you? What's eating you? So I arrived at this apartment to find my grandmother's siblings, Betty and Martha and Henry, now in their 80s, all with that distinctive Russian-German face, looking like my grandmother. And the apartment was like 90 degrees. And Henry sitting under a blanket. That's the way it works. And we sat and chatted for a while. We got to know each other. One of my aunts said, "We hear that you're a reader, Bob. Henry is a fan of the Russian novelists." So then that was our bonding. We talked about Dostoevsky. And I said to Henry, "You want to take communion? Tell me what's in your heart." And he said he'd taken too long to come to this moment. All his life, he'd taken way too long to come to this moment. And it was almost like he realized how hungry he was now. And I just finished thinking about Jesus as the bread of life. And I talked with Henry about what it might mean to feed on Jesus. And how this moment of communion was an act of worship and of prayer and of moving out of ourselves and even our disappointments or our failures or whatever it might be that we define life by, and looking to find something for our souls, life and nourishment and healing and hope. And so we talked, and it was just Henry and I who ate and drank. I remember Martha and Betty just watching. And then I prayed, and I remember God being so close and real with us as we were feeding on the living Jesus. Henry and I worshiping together, neither of us fully understanding what we were doing or what was happening, but something was happening. Something was taking place. And then 3 weeks later, after that, a phone call came again to our apartment in Richmond. Henry had passed away. Just 3 weeks after that moment, would I be part of the family service? And someday I'm going to sit with Henry in the world to come, me and Henry, and we're going to look for Dostoevsky to join our circle. And we're going to sing Amazing Grace in Russian, because I'll know how to do that then. And we can't fully explain these dynamics. Does that comfort you? And we as your spiritual leaders say, We don't know what we're doing right now. We just know that worship answers the deepest part of the human heart and brings us into the life of God through Jesus, because we do worship through Jesus. We worship the Father by the Son through the power of the Holy Spirit. We could talk at length. I could talk to you about the meaning of this communion meal in some ways, but I still know the immensity is beyond me. But I do know this: the invitation is open to all who will come to the table to eat and to drink and to worship. Jesus said, "I am the bread of life. Whoever comes to me will never go hungry, and whoever believes in me will never be thirsty." So we invite you to the table now in this moment of worship. We ask that you come worshipfully, take of the bread and the wine, return to your seat. There are tables all around this room. You can go to one of the tables near you. And then when we're all seated, we'll take together in just a moment. Would you come?